This class takes up one of the most challenging moral questions in Halachah. How far should we go to redeem captives? We'll look at how this issue unfolded in Jewish communities around the world during the 15th and 16th centuries, what actually happened, and how the poskim grappled with the Mishnah's rule against paying more than market value. In a future class, we'll revisit this topic in the modern context of Israel and its ongoing struggle against terrorism. We're going to begin today with Shilas Atshuvis Mahari Weil. His name is Rabbi Yaakov Weil. He lived in the 1400s in Ashkenaz in Germany. His last rabbinic post, was in the German city of Erfurt, and that is likely where he was when the following story transpired. This is Simin Kuf Memches. He's writing this letter to another contemporary rabbi, a very famous rabbi at the time, whose name was Rabbi Yisrael Bruna, or Rabbi Yisrael of Brun, who lived in Brun. Ahuvai, my beloved, Ahuvi, my beloved, Meirenu Arav Rabbi Yisrael. He's writing to Rabbi Yisrael. And the way we know it's him is we have Rabbi Yisrael of Bruno's response, as we're going to see later. What does Rabbi Yaakov Weil want from Rabbi Yisrael of Bruno? He says, please have a look at the stuff I'm sending you. It's a letter from a man by the name of David Tzener. David Tzener, interestingly, is mentioned elsewhere in Ma'ari Weil. So he gets he surfaces twice. And the other time it's a shaila about whether it's permitted for him to carry, and the word is cholent, from a chatzar of a yid to another chatzar of a yid through a chatzar of a goy. So it's probably the same David Tzener. That's my assumption. And here we have a letter from the Reb David Tzener, and he's known here as the Nediv, so he's a philanthropist. This philanthropist is yelling, Hutzoyek. He's writing to you, Reb Yisrael of Brun, about a man by the name of Avram Ezra. About a man named Avram Ezra. What's the story? This Reb David, he worked really, really hard to get out of prison, out of captivity, and they were in a situation where their lives were on the line. Who? The wife and the granddaughter of Avram Ezra. So Reb David worked really hard to get the wife and the granddaughter of Avram Ezra out of captivity. From later on in the Tshuvas, we know what his wife's name was. Avram Ezra's wife's name was, in the Tshuvas, it comes out as Vreda with a Vav. But that is because the Vav and the Fei, there are certain instances in Ashkenaz where what we today would say as a Fei, they say as a Vav. This actually came up at the exhibit where we saw Fivish, right? He wrote his name as Vivish, and we discussed that. So here also her name is Vreda, which is the name of Freda, and the poskim discuss this because it comes up in Gittin, how you spell the name Freda in a get, Vav or a Fei, depending on where you are from. Okay. Reb David did a good job. He did a good job. He got the wife and granddaughter out. Okay. Omale Shahaya Barar like Keshemesh. Now he goes on to say, if he didn't know for sure that A, their lives were in danger, and B, that there was no other way how to get them out other than under the terms that he worked on. We'll see what those terms are soon. Then definitely he would not have put himself into this, and he definitely wouldn't have put himself up to be the guarantor. So in other words, what happened is Reb David strikes a deal with the captor, and he says, this is how much money you're going to be getting. Release the wife and the granddaughter. I'm going to serve as the guarantor. So he's not only working hard as a negotiator, he's also putting himself on the line by saying, I'm going to be the guarantor. And in fact, Rabbi Yaakov Weil goes further and he says that I heard from a reliable person who was involved in this story that when Reb David was sending a communication to Avram Ezra, because remember, it's Avram Ezra's wife and grandchild. So when Reb David sent a communication that the Duke wants no less than 1,000 florins. elef zehuvim. So now we know that there was a duke. The duke is the one who's holding the woman and the granddaughter in captivity. And the price is 1,000 gold coins to get them free. Moreover, the messenger said that they were threatening that if you're not going to pay the money, we're going to take the little girl and we're going to convert her. It's easy. You hand her over to the monastery and then she's going to be converted to Christianity. And there were also other threats that aren't specified. So when the shliach of Reb David came to Avram Ezra and conveyed all of this information, Avram Ezra responded and said, what am I supposed to do? What am I able to do? My connection is the bishop. And what it seems is that Avram Ezra, he lived in the Holy Roman Empire. Some people lived in free cities. Some people lived under bishops. And some people lived under dukes. So the duke was the one who took the granddaughter and the grandmother into captivity. And we also know from later in the tshuva, they were traveling to a wedding. They were traveling to a wedding of this lady's, of Avram Ezra's son. Okay, so they were traveling to, they probably went through this territory belonging to the duke. And what's going to become pretty clear, as you're going to see, Avram Ezra is a very wealthy man. The duke says, I can use some of Avram Ezra's money. The way I'm going to get that money, I'm going to take his wife and his granddaughter as hostage. And I'm going to demand how much? 1,000 golden coins. And I'm going to threaten with all the threats. Now, Avram Ezra doesn't live under the duke. He doesn't know this duke. He doesn't have connections with the duke. But he has connections with a hegmon, with a bishop. He's probably living under a bishop. And so he goes to the bishop and says, maybe you could help me out. The bishop says, the more I've tried to get involved in this, he gives the exact language, the quote in German that the bishop said, the more I get involved, the more problems I've been causing. So in other words, Reb Yaakov Weil wants to establish that not only Reb David Senner did a good job in getting him out, but there was no other option. There was no other way for these two, for the woman and girl to get out. David Senner is the only one who got them out because this guy's connections, which were the bishop, was turned up nothing. Okay, so then what happened? What's the problem? The problem is, Ure'ei mar gam re'ei, please, Rabbi Yisrael Bruna, look into this. How a spirit of impurity has passed over Avram Ezra. He's like, nope, I'm not paying you. I am not paying you for the 1,000 gold coins that you guaranteed. I'm not doing it. Generally speaking, Rabbi Yaakov Weil, I should add, later in there's two tshuvas on this. We're reading Kuf Mem Ches, either in Kuf Mem Ches or in Kuf Mem Tes. He has an entire paragraph of writing about the negative character of this Avram Ezra. Okay. So, now Rabbi Yaakov Weil continues and says, I wrote to Avram Ezra, and I said, before the deadline comes up, because the duke let them out, there's a guarantor, and they need to pay up by a certain date, because to accumulate that type of money takes time. They need to let him, so the duke let them free already. But now you need to pay up, and there's a guarantor. David Senner is on the line. So I wrote to Avram Ezra, you must pay up before the deadline comes. And he wrote back to me. He wrote back to me a letter defending his decision not to pay. But he didn't write well. He wrote improperly to me. And at this point, Rabbi Yaakov Weil goes through numerous arguments that this Avram Ezra wrote to him and his response. So one of the arguments was, what do you mean I was talking to the bishop and he promised me he's going to resolve the whole issue and I'm not going to have to pay anything. And then you went and you paid and now I'm on the line for that money? Says Rabbi Yaakov Weil, that taina is nonsense because we have eidos that the bishop said he can't do anything. So don't say that he had another way of solving this problem. Another thing Avram Ezra said is, what's the rush? Wait a little longer, and then ultimately we could strike a deal. What do you mean, so Rabbi Yaakov Weil responds, what do you mean, what's the rush? Your wife is old. He says, he's skein of a Halachah, she's old and weak. If you're going to keep her there in prison, then she may die. So of course there's a rush. And within that time, if you're going to wait, maybe they're going to take the little girl and they're not going to hand her over to the nuns in the monastery. So was there a rush? Yeah. Did you have an alternative option, Avram Ezra? No. So Reb David behaved properly. Okay. But now there's the next taina. Here's the next taina from Avram Ezra in his letter to Rav Yaakov Weil. He wrote, Ufada yoiser michmei demei, and I have a taina against Reb David because he redeemed them more than their amount, more than the proper amount. Pada yoiser michmei demei. That's number one. Number two, the yoiser mishayesh yechaylis biyad yilageh, more than I can afford. So Rav Yaakov Weil now has to respond to these two details. Says Rav Yaakov Weil, Lav mi pivanu chayim. We're not going to rely on him when he says he can't afford it. Look at this language over here about this man's wealth. The galoi v'yadu ala kol, everyone knows. Umeragla b'fumei kol b'nei avadin, and everyone in this area, in this province knows. Mulim v'arelim, Jews and the Havdil non-Jews. The gavra omidhu, that this guy has the money. She'ein dugmasei ba'esher b'chal ha'medina. There is no one as wealthy as he is in the entire area. Which now we'll know why the Duke Chaptan found out there's a wedding and that his wife and daughter is going through his area and why he took them hostage. This guy's the wealthiest guy around. So now when he comes and he says he can't afford it, we don't believe him. Okay, now that addressed very well the words Reb Avram Ezra's taina that I can't afford it. But in addition to saying, I can't afford it, Avram Ezra said something else. He said the words, Upada yoiser michmei demei. He paid more than he should have paid. That is a Talmudic argument. So now let's learn about the background of that Talmudic argument. So the Mishnah in Gittin says as follows in Perek Daled Mishnah Vav, Ein poidin as hashvuyim yeser al dmeim, that when we redeem captives, and yes, there's a mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim, we do not do this mitzvah more than the amount, more than their worth, more than the appropriate amount of money. But Pashtus, we'll see a dissenting view later. But Pashtus, what this means is that in ancient society, and definitely in times of the Mishnah, every person walking around always could put a price tag on their life. What does that mean? How can you put a price tag on your life? You can't do that. You could do that. Why? Because if you had an extra few minutes, you walk to the town center or to the marketplace, and you go to the slave market over there, and every day there's slaves that are for sale, and the price is determined by how tall they are, how strong they are, how young they are, etc., gender, and all these things. And then you have a comp, and then you can know how much you are worth. And Bapashtos, and many Rishonim learn this way, that's what it means over here. That if we are paying pidyon shvuyim and it's comparable to what's going on in the slave market, no problem. But we're not allowed to do more. Why? Bipnei tikkun ha'olam. We don't do it because of tikkun ha'olam. This is part of a series of Mishnayos that have enactments that are about living in a normal, civilized world where things aren't getting out of hand and people and the world is functioning, the economy is functioning, and the community is functioning in a normal way. And that's why we have this takana derabana. So the Gemara asks a question. The Gemara wants to know, what is the tikkun olam ibayluhu? So the Gemara asks a shaila, haim b'pnei tikkun olam. What is the tikkun olam? Is it mishum doicha kod tzipuru? So option one is doicha kod tzipuru, the difficulty this puts on the community. Rashi explains, what does it mean, the difficulty this puts on the community? This is a here and now problem. This is not about the future. This is about here and now. You want to get someone out of captivity. You want to pay. Who's paying? The community is going to pay. So that's stressful to pay a high amount of money. That's stressful. And so that would be the reason that tikkun olam, we want to have that people should have money in their pockets for everyday life. And that's why we said don't overpay. That's option A. But there's another option. That they don't plunder and bring more. What does it mean they don't plunder, bring more? This is a future concern. And this is the idea that if we're going to overpay, we're essentially incentivizing that they come kidnap Jews. Because if you kidnap a regular person and you sell them on the slave market, you make $10. But Jews are paying more than the slave market, so you can make $20. And then why? There's only 6 people. If I'm a pirate, I can only put 6 people in my little ship. So I might as well bring more Jews. So is it this or is it that? And Rashi says right away, what's the difference? The difference is, what if there's a gvir who says, I volunteer to pay? The first concern is not there. It's not a burden on the community. But the second concern is still there. Because even though the gvir is saying, I'm going to pay of my own pocket, but one second, that itself may be incentivizing future kidnappings. So the Gemara wants to resolve which of the two is it. Toshma, we're going to bring a raya for one of the two ways from a story. What's the story? The Levi Bar Darga, there's an individual by the name of Levi Bar Darga. And Parko Labarte, he redeemed his daughter, Betreisar Alfe Dinar Rezav, with 13,000 golden coins. Which obviously is a huge amount of money. And so what here, this seems to prove that the issue is the community burden. And because in this case, he wasn't imposing a community burden because he was wealthy and did this on his own, therefore it was fine. So here's a raya that we are concerned about the here and now financial, and the Chachamim never made, doesn't mean we're not concerned about the future, but the Chachamim never spoke about it. They never made a ban. So do what you want. The Chachamim never made a ban and said, don't do the mitzvah Pitin Shvuyim because of this future concern. That's what the Gemara is holding right now. Amar Abaye rejects the proof. Who's Levi Bar Darga? It's not like we have a long biography of him in the Art Scroll series of Gedolim to know that he was this fascinating, this great holy individual. Or another way of saying it is, who said he did the right thing? Maybe he did the wrong thing. And so therefore, this is where the sugya ends. And so this question, this issue ultimately is not resolved over there. What's the psak din? Because there's a major nafkamina between these two things. So if you look at the Rambam and also on the Torah, you'll see that they come out on the side that say the main concern is the second concern. Let's read the Torah inside. We don't overpay. Why? We don't want to create an incentive for enemies to sacrifice themselves even to come and lisha boisam and to come and to capture fellow Jews. This is how the Rambam says it. This is how the Torah says it. And therefore, even if the family wants to do it, and they're not going to put it on the community. So the first concern is not a concern. Still, we don't let them. This takana of the Rabbanan means we don't let them. Now the Gdolei poskim, generally speaking, are the Rif, the Rosh, the Rambam, and the Torah. And definitely for the sources we're going to be looking at, they would have been looking up at these four sources. The Rif and the Rosh are silent on this issue. They don't tell us one way or the other. But the Rambam and the Torah do tell us that is the second way. And that obviously is going to have a significant influence. And now we could understand why this individual is coming and saying, hey, this guy paid more. He's referring to this sugya over here. In other words, Avram Ezra, was he a lamdan? It's hard to know. Did he have a lamdan lawyer who was working with him? Again, ich weiß nicht. But Papoyo, he's bringing this Talmudic argument, that that's what he said to Mari Vail. He said, Upada Yosef made the man. You overpaid. You're not allowed to overpay. It's a befedish Gemara. You're not allowed to do it. And there's no exceptions. There's no exceptions. And so because there's no exceptions, this was wrong. Why should I now have to pay you back for something that you did wrong? Good. And now we'll notice that Mari Vail, Yaakov Vail, never answered that. He never answered the taina. He only answered the taina. You said you don't have the money. Yes, you do have the money. And I want to know, why did Rabbi Yaakov Vail not answer the taina? That's a driving question that we would like to do for today's shir. Now, I mentioned before that Rabbi Yaakov Vail was writing to who? To Rabbi Yisrael Bruna. Rabbi Yisrael of Bruna. Because he wants to get him to join him to tell Avram Ezer he must pay. And that's what happened. Rabbi Yisrael Bruna wrote exactly that. He wrote to Avram Ezer in a much more respectful way. He even uses language of harav the whole time. Rabbi Yaakov Vail never calls Avram Ezer harav or even reb. But Yisrael Bruna calls him harav, and he calls him reb, and he calls him ahuvi. But at the end of the day, he says, you got to pay up. What about the fact that ein poidin yosrach al michmei demeyan? And Mari Vail, Yaakov Vail didn't answer that. Yisrael Bruna, he realizes the gap and he comes and he fills in the gap. Zok the Gemara in Gittin Daf Nun Ches Amar Aleph, Rabbi Yisrael brings this Gemara. What's the Gemara? There's a story, Rabbi Yisrael ben Chananya, he went to a large Roman city. They let him know that there's a child in incarceration. He went and he interviewed this kid, and the Gemara describes how he figured out this kid's a genius. And he says, this child is going to be a Moira Hayra Yisrael. And he makes a shvua that he is going to get this kid out, b'chol mamayin shapoiskin alav. Whatever it is, I'm gonna get him out. Amru, and the tradition has that that's indeed what he did. Lo izaz misham ad sheptoi b'mamayin harbe. And who did this kid end up being? The great Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. So immediately you have a story over here. I'm going to pay anything? What do you mean you're going to pay anything? What about this takana darabanan that's in the Mishnah? So Tosfos asks the shaila right over there. And Tosfos says, no, there's an exception. There's an exception to the rule. What is the exception to the rule? when there's sakonas nefashos, then it makes sense to say if the person's life is at risk, it makes sense that we're going to overpay. Then this whole Mishnah, this whole Iboyalu, the whole sugya that we had in the Gemara is only if the person's life is not at risk. If the person's life is at risk, and here Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya, this child, Rabbi Shmuel, his life was at risk, so then you're allowed to overpay. Where do we see this? So Tosfos brings a raya. Tosfos' raya goes as follows. There's another din that says that if a person sells himself into slavery, so 1-2 times you get the person out, but ultimately then we say a third time you're on your own. We're not getting you out. Then what happens is, what about his children? So after this guy passes away, so then we get his children out. Why do we need to get his children out? We need to get his children out because we're worried that they're gonna assimilate, they're gonna identify as non-Jews. So there's a Maisa in the Gemara where Rav Ami says, basically someone sold himself into slavery, and Rav Ami paid to get him out. Why did you pay to get him out? I thought you don't do it. So he said, one second, if I get your kids out because of spiritual death, I'm going to get you out because of physical death. In other words, because he was in a dangerous situation. So what you see from here is, you see from this whole discussion that if it's physical harm, we waived the takana. Which takana over there? For a life-threatening situation, we waived the takana of you don't pay to get the guy out who sold himself into slavery. So just like it bumps that away, so too it's going to bump away this takana that you're not going to overpay. This is Tosfos' explanation. Tosfos continues and says, Inami, another explanation is that this child is different. Mishum de muflag b'chachma, he is a genius, and geniuses are very different. There's 2 ways of understanding this second answer. Why is a genius why is a Talmud Chacham or a huge Talmud Chacham, why is he very different? One explanation is we have to make sacrifices to preserve Torah. And malasot. This is a way we show that we cherish Torah, that we preserve Torah, that we want to hear in the next generation. And so therefore, the stress on the community, too bad. Even we don't want to incentivize future kidnappings, too bad. We need to ensure that we have Torah in the future generations. That's one, I think, the more normative way of understanding this. Another way of understanding the exception for the Chacham is brought by some Mefarshim, where they say, you tell the captors, by the way, we're overpaying, but why? Because you got a special guy. You didn't realize, you just thought you got a very special guy. So now what's he going to do? He's going to now figure out who's a Talmud Chacham or not. They don't have that type of intelligence. So essentially the whole issue of incentivizing doesn't apply, and so therefore that's why there's an exception for the Talmud Chacham. Okay. Now the Ramban, while he accepts the exception for the Talmud Chacham, as I think all Rishonim do, does not accept the first point made by Tosfos that if life is at stake, then the law changes. What's Ramban's raya? Read the Mishnah. It says you don't redeem captives, you don't overpay. What's a regular shavui is sipping pina coladas? No, a regular shavui their life is always in danger. He quotes a Gemara. The Gemara says that Pidyon Shvuin is the greatest form of tzedakah. Why? Because the shavui is hungry and his life's in danger as well, and so therefore it's the greatest form of tzedakah. So we see that Halachah treats the default captive as his life being in danger. So when the Mishnah said, don't redeem the captive for more than the amount, it meant someone who's in danger. So you can't say there's an exception when life's in danger, and so therefore the Ramban says, V'loi mistaber. It's not true. D'chol shvi, anytime someone is a captive, kulu isnu ubei, they have all of the disadvantages, including the disadvantage of their life being under threat. Others have pointed out another problem over here. As much as you're worried now about this guy's pikuach nefesh, and we're like, we need to save this guy, but if you incentivize future people, and now those future people are also going to be life in danger, so why all of a sudden should the pikuach nefesh of this person trump the pikuach nefesh in the future? So this is part of the debate that we already see. It begins in the time of the Rishonim, and it continues down to today. The debate of whether this rule is enforced even in a case when it means that we don't get the guy out, the captive is gonna die. But relevant for our discussion right now, we're talking about the case that happened in the 1400s with Avram Ezra, and we're looking for an answer. Why was it okay for Reb David Senzer to overpay? Yisrael Bruna says, I'll give you the answer. The answer is Tosfos. The answer is Tosfos that it's pikuach nefesh. That's the answer. Now, where's the pikuach nefesh? He doesn't say because these people would have been killed. It's interesting. Although Yaakov Weil did mention numerous times that their life was literally in danger, like this lady's going to die. She's old and weak. She's going to die. Mari Bruna doesn't do that. If you look at his language, you'll see that what he does is he says, for the girl, death is the spiritual death, same thing. Pikuach nefesh begashmi is pikuach nefesh beruchni is same thing. And so that's pikuach nefesh, so that should be permitted for her. And in terms of the woman, he says her situation is in inuyim, torture, which is gara mimisa, which is worse than death. And he quotes a famous Gemara. The Gemara says, Chanani, Mishal, and Arzai are ready to die al Kiddush Hashem, not to bow to an idol. But if they would have been beaten and tortured, then they would have, God forbid, they wouldn't have passed the test. So what do you see? What's more difficult for a person to withstand? Torture is worse. So therefore, what Mari Bruna is doing, he's essentially expanding the pikuach nefesh heter, the pikuach nefesh exception. We have a pikuach nefesh exception. It's a debate between Ramban and Tosfos. But fine, according to Tosfos, you have a pikuach nefesh exception. Mari Bruna says, well, we're going to expand that to pikuach nefesh beruchnius. Okay, number one. And number two, we're going to expand it to a situation of torture that's worse than death. So he says the woman is in that situation, and he concludes, therefore, and says, L'chein chayev Reb Avram, liftois v'lefroy Reb David. Yes, Reb Avram has to pay Reb David. This is what he says, which now forces a little bit the question, change the question a little. Why doesn't Yaakov Weil, he didn't address it. There's kind of an obvious answer that's available to him. Why does he not give this answer? Why does Rabbi Yaakov Weil, again, not address this at all? And as we continue, I'd like to make a suggestion as we look at more and more sources from, I don't have more from the 1400s. These are the ones from the 1400s. But when we go into the 1500s and we look at numerous sources, I think that I'd like to propose a answer to this question as we're going to see. So let's look at more cases. We're now going to turn away from Ashkenaz and we're going to travel all the way to Egypt to the Radvaz, David ibn Zimra. He lived in the 1500s. He was born in Spain. Then he made his way to Eretz Yisrael and lived in Mitzrayim. Okay, L'Bseif Yamav he was in Sfas. So he has the following question. Shalos Tshuvas Radvaz Chelek Aleph Siman Mem. You asked me a question. It says, Ein Peidin Sashun Yisrach Mei Dmeyan. What does that mean, Dmeyan? And the questioner gives two options. Does it mean the slave market, or does it mean the hostage market? So the reality is, during the 1500s, there are actually two different types of captive markets. One is the slave market, one is the hostage market. What's the difference between the two? So a slave market is that you're selling it to someone who's looking for labor. How many potential buyers are there? Many. There are many potential buyers, anyone who wants a slave. But from a buyer's perspective, when you're walking by that slave that's being sold, how many options do you have? Probably hundreds. There are probably hundreds of different options. Like, should I get this guy who's stronger, this guy who's weaker, right? There's a lot of different options that you have. And what happens when there's a lot of options? So then the prices come down. So the competition, the fact that there are so many different slaves that are on the market and you can buy many different ones and there's variation between them, that drives the prices down. But then you have the hostage market. Hostage market is different. The guy who gets this hapless individual, they don't bring them to the slave market. They send a message to the family. Like our story is here. They sent a message to, what was his name? Avram Ezra. And they say, by the way, we have this person. You're not getting this person back unless you give a certain amount of money. So now, for the family, there's no one else. It's not like, instead of getting him back, we'll go someone else. There's no one else. We want my son back. We want our daughter back. So essentially, this is what we call in economics a monopoly. The seller is the only one who has the product that you need. And what happens when there's a monopoly? It drives the prices up. And so these two markets, as much as they may sound similar, slave markets, much cheaper than hostage markets. So someone is asking the Radvaz, when the Gemara says that you can't overpay more than the market, which of these two markets it is? Now, this could sound like someone was learning Daf Yomi and he had a Shaila in Gemara, he turned to the Radvaz. It is very, very clear definitely from the way the Radvaz is answering the question, that this was not someone who wants to know Pshat of the Gemara. This is someone who's looking at the reality in front of him and says, we're paying a lot of money for Pidyon Shvuyim. And maybe it makes sense in the hostage market, but it does not make sense in the slave market, and that's really what's driving the question, as is going to become clear from the answer. Tshuva says it as Vavs. The minig of all Jews is we pay more than the slave market. How do I know? Because a zaken or a katan ein shava b'shuk yesem asar dinar. On the slave market, an old person or a child's only worth 10 dinar. And yet we pay 100 or more. So obviously this payment is not reflecting slave market. So then why is this okay? The reason it's okay is as follows. The reason is because we follow the hostage market. And it's okay to follow the hostage market. If you follow the logic of the Gemara, this makes sense. The reason why the Chacham made their takana is we don't want to incentivize kidnapping. We see they're not coming out to target us. They're anyone, Jew or Gentile. Even if it's more than the slave market, because it's not more than the hostage market for Gentiles, mutter, it's okay. And leave the Jews alone. Jews are kind and they're getting their brothers and sisters out, and leave them alone is fine. Why? Yes, we're paying much more than the slave market. We're not paying more than the hostage market. There are hostages also for non-Jews where the pirates come and they take the non-Jew and they come to the family and they say, we're the only one who has this guy. You need to give us money. And fine, it's much higher, but we pay that price. And fine, so be it. That's okay. You're not incentivized. Why would they come and look for Yidden? But he says, but to pay more than the hostage market, that ain't right, because then you're going to cause a problem. Now, Taki, you're going to incentivize. Because in the hostage market, for a Gentile, you're only getting X amount of money, but if it's a Jew, it's more money. Then he has another prat. That it is well known that Jews, the hostage concept works even if they have no money. Which means as follows. If a pirate wants to do slavery, okay, we know what that is. If a pirate wants to do hostage, he needs to be strategic, because if he takes a poor non-Jew, he's not going to get anything. Because the family doesn't have a support system that's going to be able to help him get his hostage out. And so the non-Jew has to be strategic and choose from a wealthy family. But with Yidden, it's different, because even if he gets a poor Jew, it is well known the Jews, they band together and they get them out. So the Radvaz is like saying that's a reason we need to be really, really careful that we can't go more than the hostage market. More than the slave market is fine, but we can't go more than the hostage market, because then we're going to incentivize us because of the higher price and because any Jew that you get is going to get you some money. Okay, now if the tshuva ended here, I think we would say, okay, there's an expansion, right? Most people assumed that it has to be slave market, but fine. At least he has logic here, and he gives you another way of looking at it. So he expanded it, and he gave us another valid way of looking at it. The amazing thing is, the tshuva continues. Look at this tshuva. And if you're going to persist and you're going to ask, that's not the reality. The reality is the Jewish community is paying more than the typical hostage market. Not only that, happens all the time. And right away he says, what he means is the Jewish community celebrates this. We celebrate it. When someone does it, we go, wow, amazing. So what's going on over here? So he says, that they rely on one of 3 or 4 reasons. It looks like he's not sure himself whether to divide it into 3 reasons or 4 reasons. And he goes on to give a few svaras over here, why it's okay that we pay more than the hostage market. I'll summarize. Argument number 1, yes, we pay more than the hostage market. But once in a while, when the pirates get a good Gentile, and he comes from a family with a lot of money, so then the price is higher than the average. And we're not topping that. So we're above the average, but we're not above. It's not like the money we're paying never happens to non-Jews. And so maybe that's enough to say that they're not mamish that they're going to come running after us, because at the end of the day, you could get that amount of money. If you strike the right Gentile, you could get the right amount of money. And so therefore, the logic of the takana is still not relevant, which is why it's mutter. Then he gives another reason, the Talmud Chacham Heter. We saw before in Tosfos that Taisa said that if it's muflag b'chachma, that's one of the reasons why it was mutter for Yeshua ben Karcha to do what he did. So he brings it here. But if you look at his language, you'll see that he has to expand this heter a little. Why? Because the way Pidyon Shulin was done in his day was done, excuse me for the term, was done wholesale. Which means the captives took people wholesale. They offer them for sale or for release wholesale, and Jewish communities negotiated a deal, not one, but as a group. And so as a result, the way he says it is, maybe in the group, or let's say there's 10 hostages, maybe one of them is a Talmid Chacham. And because you can't get one out, that's not the way it works. So it justifies, Tosfos' heter justifies now taking out the whole group, even if it's more. So that's another reason. Then he says, there's another svara. The third svara is, maybe there are children who are going to be forced to convert to another religion. And if so, he says, Nimsa she'ein anu poidin el hadas, then we're not really redeeming them. The Mishnah said you're not allowed to redeem them more than, we're not really redeeming them, we're redeeming the Jewish religion. That's the words he uses over here. And then he adds another prat. This is probably, he's not sure if this is part of 3 or if this is 4. He says, over derech klal, they forced them to be mechal Shabbos and Yom Tif. And then he adds that there's physical torture, which I understand to be one of the ways they're going to chas v'shalom cause someone to convert, or one of the ways they cause Chilul Shabbos and Yom Tif. And so that's also, we don't want to have Chilul Shabbos and Yom Tif, and I don't think that Takana Derabanan was put in place when there's going to be Chilul Shabbos and Yom Tif. Now, he recognizes right away that these arguments are anything but a slam dunk. He even started off saying that it's V'yesh Loimar. Each one of these is a V'yesh Loimar. So he says, and even though someone could come and say, when the Tana said, Ein poidin es ashvuyin, yoiser mei demeyan, he had all this in mind, and he said, still, don't do it. He said, yeah, you could say that, but you could also say like me, that he didn't have it in mind. And so because it could go either way, and the minig is like this, so let's leave the Jewish people by their minig, chivin shadavar safik, hanach lam li Yisrael. This is language in the Gemara, where if you see Jews, Yirei Shamayim, doing something, and it could be grounded in some way in Halachah, so then leave it alone. Then he adds another point. He says, and by the way, we're not forcing. They're coming alone, and they're asking to do this on their own, the Yidden. And so therefore, en kam beis michush. This is a very, very surprising line. The Gemara itself said that, I don't care if you're volunteering. Levi Bar Darga also volunteered, but the Gemara said maybe it was wrong, because if we're worried about incentivizing, then Levi Bar Darga's volunteering is a problem. And yet here he's saying, this is another reason why it's okay, because no one's forcing them. They're coming alone and they're doing it on their own. So I think what he means over here is, yeah, for an individual on their own, that's a problem. Because who gives you a right? You're overpaying. Now you're going to incentivize danger for the community. But a community together? A community together? That's different. A community together to say, we choose to get these guys out now. It means there's going to be a risk to us. We are willing to take that risk. Oh, okay, fine. So then he adds that in. That's another reason why it's going to be okay. And he concludes his tshuva saying, "V'yafa nagu lahachzik b'midas Avram Avinu." It is very good that we stick with the midah of Avram Avinu. And he quotes the pasuk Nedivei Amim Am Elekei Avram. He's teaching this pasuk that who's Nedivei Amim, who's the most generous and the most kind of all nations? It's Am Elekei Avram. It's the Jewish people who have the trait of Avram Avinu, and that's how he signs off this particular tshuva. What you see from here is that he said, there was basically, it becomes very clear that at least in Egypt, during the 1500s, they were overpaying, and perhaps big time, for Jewish hostages. And now the question is, how do we say, what is the heter? And within his tshuva, he gave us, he said 3 or 4 different points. He did not raise, by the way, the point of Pikuach Nefesh, interestingly. He did not raise the point of Pikuach Nefesh. So if you take Pikuach Nefesh with his 3.5 points, so then you have 4.5 points. And now we see there's multiple avenues for what this heter could look like. So now let's come back to Rabbi Yaakov Weil. My understanding of Rabbi Yaakov Weil, and I'm going to reinforce this as we go along, is that the minig in Ashkenaz and in all communities essentially was, there were hostages, we got them out. You have a shaila from the Mishnah, okay, you have a good shaila. But the minig, and everyone knew this minig. Everyone knew we get the hostages out. And there's a shaila in terms of, is it this heter, is it that heter, is it that heter? And I'll show you more heterim and more explanations as we move along. I read Rabbi Yaakov Weil as saying, I don't need to respond to that. You get into a pilpul if it's this or that. The mitzias is that the minig is that way. So it's laughable when Avram Ezra says, oh, invoking the Mishnah. We know the Mishnah exists, but guess what? I don't have to take that argument seriously because look what Yidden have been doing, and this has been an established thing for a long time, and I read Rabbi Yaakov Weil going in from that way. Yisrael Bruna said, oh, you want the lumdus, I'll give you the lumdus. And he gave a lumdus about pikuach nefesh. You could have given other lumdus as well. So you see there's other, to clarify, he gave the lumdus of pikuach nefesh and applied it to torture and applied it to conversion. Fine, there are other possible arguments as well, but that's my take it or leave it interpretation of Reb Yaakov Weil. What I want to do now is I want to show you that this Radvaz is not in a vacuum, and likewise Marie Weil is not in a vacuum, and Yisrael Bruno is not in a vacuum. When we look at the literature from, I showed you a little from the 1400s, and now we'll look at the 1500s, you'll see time and again that the Jewish people are overpaying to get their captives out. That's what they're doing. And they're coming up with different justifications for why this is mutter. So let's go to the next example. The next example comes from a very interesting sefer. It's called Omer HaShikha. Omer HaShikha is a commentary on Mishlei. The author of this commentary, his name is Rabbi Avram Gavishain. He lives in North Africa, in Tlemcen, in Algiers, and he lives during the 1500s. And he writes, he wants to talk about being proactive and not being lazy, because it's a commentary on Mishlei. And he says, I heard from Magidei Emes that when Tlemcen, which is a city in North Africa, in Algeria, when it was captured by Akum, this presumably some Christian invasion, in the year Shin Beis Hey, which is the year 1542, there were about 1,500 Jews who were captured. A number of them went to Fez in Morocco. They went west to Morocco to ask the Jewish community in Morocco to pay for their release. But the Jewish community in Morocco could not pay to get all of them out. What does it mean, roi vakamos va'echos? So number one, there's a lot of captives, 1,500 is a lot. Number two, what's the echos mean? Because the amount, the asking price was more than what they were worth, more than the market price. Okay, now, before he tells you what happens next, he gives you a little background. That when this invasion happened, and I'm sorry I didn't look too much into who these invaders were, but when this invasion happened, there were two attitudes amongst the Jewish community in Tlemcen. Some said, let's get out of here. There's an enemy coming, it's dangerous, let's get out of here. And they ran away, and they went to a village. And the village initially said, yeah, we'll protect you. But then what the villagers did, as often happens in Jewish history, they called the enemy and they said, by the way, we have a whole bunch of Jews hiding over here. You give us a certain amount of money, we'll hand them over to you. And that's what happened. So that happened. And so this 1,500 Jews includes some of those. There were some, the invasion happened, they sat in Tlemcen, they didn't do anything. They said, we're happy here, everything's going to be beseder. So now the community in Fez needs to get them out. And the community in Fez learns that this happened, that some were proactive, tried running away, it didn't work. And some, they sat back. So the rabbi in Fez, his name was Chacham Yehuda Uziel. And he basically gave the psak. He said, look, we can't get everyone out, so we need some sort of hierarchy here. We need some sort of triage. So his triage was, don't tell me age, don't tell me health, I don't care about that. The people who tried, who were proactive and tried to save themselves, they're going first. They're going first. Why? Because they did their best to save themselves. And so because they made their hishtadlos, so we need to recognize that and we need to get them out first. Those people who sat back and they were lazy, nisatzlu v'nisrashlu, they're going to be later. Aday's case, whenever. Okay? So that's now this raises a very, very important topic of triage in Bechlal and triage in hostages. Here you have a point of view. I am not saying this is definitive. This was one rabbi poskening for one moment, a very, very interesting moment. My key takeaway is, what do you have over here? You have a case in the 1500s where This is very clear evidence that they were overpaying for their hostages. And again, it's not a halacha sefer, so I'm not expecting him to get into a deal, but he takes it as a matter of fact, and he doesn't assume that his readers would be surprised. Hey, what do you mean? But there's a Mishnah. You know why he doesn't assume that? Because this was very, very normal. And because this was very normal, he writes it as a matter of fact that they were being redeemed. Yoiser michedei shavla. Let's go to the next example. The next example, the rabbi is Rabbi Yeshua Tzuntzin. Now, I hope you realize that name Tzuntzin sounds very similar to Sansino. Yes, so there was a printer's family in the late 1400s in Italy. They're known as the Sansinos, and we've spoken about them in the past. Eventually, this family moves over to the Ottoman Empire, to Constantinople, and he is a descendant from this family, and he's a Rav. Shalos Tshuvas Nachal Yeshua Siman Hey. And he lived in the 1500s. He passed away in 1569 in Constantinople. He was a rabbi in Constantinople, today Istanbul. And he says there was a story that happened in the year Hey Shin Yud Aleph, which is 1551, that the great king Hamelach Ha'adir, he's referring to his king, he's his sultan, Suleiman. He sent a whole bunch of ships, and they captured Trababulus Asher Bibiria. This means Tripoli, that is North Africa, which is known as Barbary, etc. And in this city, 40 Jews were captured. And the Sar Tzava took them. We actually know the name of the general who led this invasion. According to Google, his name is Dragut. Okay. Vehela es demeyan kiflayim ishivyon. Twice their worth is what he says you need to pay to get these out. So, but Pashtus, the sale is happening. He probably brought them back to the capital of the Ottoman Empire, to Constantinople, where Rabbi Yeshua Tzuntzin is the Rav. So some of the rabbis said, no, we're not going to get them out. Says Rabbi Yeshua Tzuntzin, they're wrong. Why are they wrong? So he says, let's look at the Svaris in the Gemara. One Svar in the Gemara is because of the financial stress this causes on the community. The other Svar is because you don't want to incentivize kidnapping. He says, let's talk about the incentivizing kidnapping. When does the whole incentivizing kidnapping plan work? It works against the type of hostage takers who come in the middle of the night, and they're afraid of the law, and they're afraid of police, and they're afraid of shmirah, and they're afraid of shomerim, and they're afraid of you defending yourself. They're afraid of all these things. So it's very, very hard. But you know something? They'll overcome all of that if they know that they're going to make major cash, because they can make good cash with a Jew. So then they put aside all the risk, and they say, we're going to come for the Jew. So how do you solve that problem? You solve that problem by saying, don't overpay. Now you have two layers of protection. Number one, you're not overpaying. And number two, you have your gun, you have your knife, you have your security system and all that. And you need both of them. Now they're not going to come to get you. He says, what happens when there's a military invasion? The general could do whatever he wants. There's no police, there's no shmirah, and you can't protect yourself. So what are you going to say? We're not going to pay, we're not going to overpay. He's coming to take you, no matter what. He's coming to take you. So the whole element of it being a good 1-2 punch, the fact that it's so hard for them to do what they're doing. Okay, but they'll do it if the price is right. Okay, we're not going to make the price right. Now they're not going to do it. Here, it's not hard for them. They come, they take whoever they want, whenever they want. So because they take whoever they want, whenever they want, the whole reason doesn't apply. The reason doesn't apply. You can pay whatever you want to get them out. He goes further and says, you know how do I know I'm right? He says, because they take whoever they want, even non-Jews they take, and even there's barely anyone available to even release these guys. They're taking whoever, again, they take whatever they want. And so therefore it doesn't matter. And he says, in fact, you go back to Tosfos. We spoke before about Tosfos, and Tosfos gave 2 heterim about the story of Rabbi Yeshua in the Roman city. There's another Tosfos. That Tosfos was on Daf Nun Ches and the Nuns. This one's Daf Mem Hey. And this Tosfos asks the same question. It's very interesting. This Tosfos gives also 2 answers, but it's not the same answer. This Tosfos doesn't give the answer of Pikuach Nefesh. It gives the answer of Muflug B'Chachma. And then it says, Inami b'shas churban habayis lo shayach deloy ligarvu. The whole ma'aseh of Rabbi Yeshua happened during the period when the Romans came and they occupied Eretz Yisrael. They do whatever they want, however they want, wherever they want, whenever they want. So in that climate,
They're taking whoever. So this question, you're incentivized, you're going to do this, they're going to take less. What do you mean? They're taking whoever they want. And that Tosha says that will be another reason why Rabbi Shua is allowed to overpay. Says Rabbi Shua Tzuntzin, that's what I'm saying. He quotes his Tosha. He says, that's what I'm saying. That's our situation right now. So therefore, go to that reason in the Gemara. The reason of we don't want to incentivize, basically you throw that out the window for this case. Then he says, what about Doichaka de Tzipura? He says, we know, that's easy. The community is happy to do the funding. The community is happy to do it. If the community is happy to do it, then that's not an issue whatsoever. Then he goes further and says, the MS is, even if you don't accept this argument, and even if these two problems were still real problems, doesn't matter, we still have to get all these people out. Why? Because amongst them is Ktanim and Ktanos. How many? 25. There's 25 children. And we can't peel them off. Meaning we tried coming to the general to get these kids out. Obviously to have more compassion to get the kids out. The general says, no. I know that they're a good bargaining chip. I'm holding on to the children. It's all or nothing. So, and we need to get the kids out because otherwise they're going to end up in Islam. And so we need to get the kids out because there we don't care about this Gzeira does not apply if we're going to lose them to Yiddishkeit, something that has been said a few times already. And therefore, this is and so once we need to get them out and it's one package, we need to take everybody out. This is Rabbi Yeshua Tzuntzin Maskana. And here again, you see the pattern repeating itself. That when it comes Halachah L'Maisa, we're getting the people out. And he makes arguments. He actually makes some of the arguments that he says we've had already. Some of the arguments he's saying is a new argument, and this is a pattern. Let's go now to Poland in the 1500s. Two sources left. The Marshal passed away in the 1570s. Is a contemporary of the Radvaz, and he says, goes back to the Gemara. Which of the two, remember we said before, I said the Rif didn't tell us, didn't discuss which of the two pieces of logic is the determinative one. And likewise the Rosh didn't. But the Rambam and the Tur did. Okay, the Marashal says, I have an opinion on that. You know which one's the main one? Deichega de Tzibura. That's the main one. Oh, if it's Deichega de Tzibura, then people can step up, they can do what they want, communities can be Meichel. What about the other thing? He'll say, the Rabbanon didn't think about that or didn't make that takana about it. You want to be worried about it? God bless you. You could be worried about it. That's not the takana of the Chachamim. And that's the background, he says. People in Turkey is Toigar. They overpay very, very much. They overpay. Why? Because if it's all about the financial strain and the people are moichel, God bless them. Now you'll see, what about him? What in his backyard? It sounds like this is something going on in Turkey. What about in Lublin, where the Marshal lived? So we'll get clarity about that in a minute. Look, this is all of a sudden, you have a new piece of logic here, a new heter. Because you just throw out the incentivizing problem, you embrace the strain problem, and once it's a financial strain problem, we know that that's automatically open to mechila, and all's good. Marshal continues, he gives more justifications. He says, Gam b'aveinosenu harabim, nismatu Yisrael begoila. Jews, our numbers have diminished. V'yesh lachos al yasar hapleita. We're living in a galus world where every Jew suddenly, every Jew always matters. But now, like this idea of Jews matters even more, and a Yid is in Pidyon Shmuel, we got to get the guy out because our numbers are dwindling. Very interesting argument. Then he says, the argument that's familiar to us already, they're going to force them to lavar al adas and to do malachal b'shabbos shaloi l'tzayrich, and so that's another reason. And then he says, there's also pikuach nefesh, we're afraid that maybe they're going to kill them, and if it's sakanas nafashis, then you're allowed to overpay. Wow. This is the Marshal saying this point. So if we're to pause right here, I actually tallied how many different avenues of heter for overpaying have we seen. And by the way, overpaying, firstly, there's a slave market. Overpaying even relative to the hostage market. How many heterim have we seen? Number one, pikuach nefesh. Number two, even though it's more than the hostage market, but once in a while you can find a pesagoy that does pay that amount. Number three, a chacham muflog. in Tosfos, which in other sources, Talmud Chacham was also fine. And even someone who has just the potential. And as we saw, if it's a group, then one in the group justifies the whole thing. The number 4, the threat of conversion. Number 5, the Chilul Shabbos and Yom Tov. Number 6, the very interesting argument that Advaz gave, that the community volunteering, which again, I'm giving you my understanding of it, a community could choose to volunteer and thereby assume the risk of future hostages as well. Number 7, some situations, there is no threat that they're going to come and take more. As we saw by Rabbi Yeshua Tzuntzin, the threat is not a real threat. Ultimately, we're not incentivizing more. Number 8, the Marshal. B'chlal, we don't care about that. We're not worried about that. We worry about Doichak Tzibura, which is easy to be matir. And then the argument of we've dwindled in the times of Galus. 9 different arguments. 9 different arguments that were given all in a span of 200 years. All of our sources, the earliest of our sources is the sources in Ashkenaz from the 1400s. The latest of the sources from the later in the 1500s. And here we see a very, very clear pattern. The pattern was, we get these people out, and we find a way. Now, it's so important to stress over here. To be machmir, sometimes you say, be machmir, what did you lose? If you're machmir in this takana derabanan, you're like, no, there's a takana derabanan, and let's taich it l'chumra. So what does that mean? That means you're not doing a mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim. So this is not the language of chumra and kula, is really, it's the wrong language here. Jews wanted to have a chiyuv to do the mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim. Then you have, all of a sudden, a takana darabanan that says, there's an area where you don't. I think we see over here an attempt to limit it because of the nature of the chiddush, because of the fact that there's a mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim, and because how important this is, and because within tzedakah, the Rambam says it's the highest level of tzedakah because of all the challenges that a shavui faces. So we have that mitzvah. Now you're going to come and say the Chachamim told us no. Isn't it reasonable to limit the scope of what the Chachamim were saying? And I think that ultimately is what we're seeing over here. But fine, this is something you could discuss, the different aterim and the value of each one and the strength of each one. But one of the things that I don't think is really up for dispute is the fact that this finding a heter is pretty much universal. In fact, I haven't found in this kufa, I'm not going to say a real case, where the answer of the Rav was, no, ain't poitin because it's more, and so therefore the guy's going to, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, I didn't find that there should be such a thing. Of course the din comes up. Poskim are quoting it all the time. You know, as we say, dicta, I mean, as a poskim is trying to prove something, he brings up the din. The din is still good law. 100% is still good law. But in terms of it actually being applied to a case, leaving a guy stuck in prison, I didn't see it during these centuries. The one thing I got stuck on is the Tshuva Maram Lublin. This is what we're going to focus on. And this is where we're going to conclude today's shir. Okay, Maram Lublin, he's more or less from our Tkufa. It's just the second half of the 16th century. So the later 1500s, early 1600s. He's a Rav in numerous places in Poland. And he here has a letter to the Kehila in Apt, to 2 Rabbanim. One is Rabbonim, one is Rab Yaakov, and to all of the Mahigin in the Kehila, in the Apta Kehila, about the following story. What was the story? There was a young man, a boy, he's called a Nar over here, and he was caught by the Gentiles. He's arrested by the Polish authorities. They said that he was caught with a zayna. And generally speaking, at this time, by Polish Christian law, for a Jew to have relations with a non-Jew could be punishable by death. So they want to kill him. Or they want to force him to convert, and then he'll be able to save himself. So now here are the questions. Generally, we have a mitzvah pidyon shvuyim, but does it apply in this case? Well, why should it not apply in this case? One reason is he's a mummer. He's a mummer because of the avera that he's doing. This avera is one reason. Number 2, even if you want to say he's not a mumar, but ultimately he brought this problem upon himself. It's not like he was an innocent guy. He did something he shouldn't have been doing. Then they come to the third question. And if you're going to say that we're obligated to redeem him, so is there a chiyuv even more than his market value? And by the way, what does market value mean? Those are their questions. Now, okay, this is very interesting because if you learned the Gemara, their third question, they should have asked differently. They should have asked, is it permitted to overpay? Right? Do we have to get this guy out? And if we do, is it permitted to overpay? Why? Because the Gemara says you're not allowed to overpay. They didn't ask, is it permitted? They asked, is it obligatory? Why did they ask, is it obligatory? So I think what's happening here is they know that it's mutter to overpay to get. They live in Poland in the 1500s and they know the reality. They know what's been going on century after century. So they know that it's mutter. The shaila is we know that we've been overpaying. Is that a chiyuv? We never stop to ask, is that a chiyuv or is it a shus? Because here, some people in the community are not so excited about overpaying for someone in this type of situation. And that's what they're asking over here. What's his answer? So first, he goes into the subject of a mumar. Is this guy a mumar? That's not our topic today. His answer in short is no, this guy's not a mumar. Next, he gets into the subject, if you did something wrong, does it mean we don't have to get, very important question. Pidyon Shulin doesn't apply because you did a crime. You did something wrong. So he rejects that argument as well. This is a standalone subject that we're not going to get into. And then he comes to answer the question, what about overpaying? So look at his language. We are not obligated to overpay. Now the first time I read this tshuva, I actually thought this was in conflict with all the other sources that we looked at. Because here, I read it as him saying, you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to overpay. But when I read it a second time, and I realized the language of the question and the answer, I don't think that's happening here. I think he's saying, you're not obligated to overpay, that's all. Is it mutter? They didn't ask him that, and everyone knew that it's mutter. Okay, why why would you say it's not obligatory? So he says, what do you mean? You have the Mishnah, you have the Gemara, and those rationales are still relevant over here. How are these rationales still relevant over here? Yeah, financial strain. This is a financial strain. And the incentivizing, he says, yeah, you know what's going to happen if you're going to pay money to get this guy out? They're going to do it again. They're going to libel someone. A yid goes into a non-Jewish home to do business, and they're going to say, like Yosef, Eishes Paitifra, they're going to libel him. And so you have the problem. And so therefore, is that sugya relevant? It's relevant. And so therefore, because it's relevant, what does that mean? That means that we're not going to be obligated to do it. Then he goes further and says the next line. This line is going to really make the case for me. He says, Lo ishtamet shum poisik lichtoi v'lechalek she'im mevakshim lahargoi she'mechiyavim liftoisai afilu yosem michdei dama. I'll bring evidence, he says. There is zero poskim that said that if they're going to kill him, then you are obligated to get him out. What? There are many poskim that say that the din doesn't apply if it's pikuach nefesh, starting with Tosfos, and he knows the Tosfos. So what does he mean? Well, what he means is, none of those poskim said it's obligatory. All they did is they said there is an isser. That isser doesn't apply when it's pikuach nefesh. What is it then? Then it's a heter. It's not a chiyuv. That's what he means. So it's not. I've seen many people ask this question. This seems to be, how could he, if he says, I disagree, no problem, you disagree. It's a machlekes. Ramban disagreed. Ramban said there's no exception for pikuach nefesh. But he's not doing that. He's saying no one says there's an exception. That's blatantly false. That's blatantly false, and he definitely knew otherwise. And many of the achronim who came after him struggled with this. I'm suggesting, I don't know if others have said it, I'm suggesting, very simple, he's talking about chiyuv. There is no posik that said that if it's pikuach nefesh, then it's a chiyuv, ad kadei kach? No, this svara is only enough to create a heter, not a chiyuv. All right. The tshuva, he has more over here. And in fact, he brings from the tshuva of Rabbi Yaakov Vayel. Remember, I said earlier that Rabbi Yaakov Vayel never answered why is the overpaying thing not a thing? So he says, I'll tell you why he didn't answer it. He's bringing it in. I'll tell you why he didn't answer it. He didn't answer it because because in that way, Avram Ezer was actually right. Avram Ezer was right. He was right. There's no chiyuv to pay when it is Yoser Michmei Dmeyan, and this wasn't Yoser Michmei, and that's why he didn't answer it. What do you mean? But then how come you made him pay? Yaakov Weil said, you must pay the Elav Zehuvim. So he said, well, Efsher, maybe that's really what the market value was. Okay, this is very, very difficult. The whole story is a duke went after the richest family in the entire region to get 1,000 golden coins, which is an astronomical amount of money. To say that that's what the average slave cost is very, very difficult. But I'm bringing it in because it's a story that we started off with, so I wanted to give you that piece of it. Then he goes on to say, what is Kmei Damav? It goes by the slave market. Then he says, we don't have a slave market here. Remember, Marshall, they're in the same place. They're both in Lublin, amongst other places. They're in the same place. Marshall is speaking about Turkey. And he also says, we don't have, how are you going to assess a slave? We don't have a slave market. Why? It's very simple. In Eastern Europe, you had the moisid called serfdom. Serfdom meant you had the landowners, they owned the land. You wanted to live on my land, no problem. So you need to live here. This is the type of work you need to do for this amount of time. And you're not free to leave, right? It's chatzi slavery, but it's not full slavery. In a serfdom society, there's no buying and selling of people. They don't work that way. You could buy an estate, and if you bought the estate, it came along with all the serfs. But it was not legal to take a serf for one paritz, to take a serf and sell it to another. They didn't have kinyan aguf to use language, that type of language. What they had was, you're not allowed to leave. You have to stay here because you live on my land, so you owe me. And part of owing me is all your labor goes to me. So it was like a chatzi type of slavery. Well, in that reality, you don't need real slavery. If you have serfdom, you don't need real slavery. And so there was no real slavery market in Poland, which is why they don't know how to do prices. He's saying, I don't know how to do it, which is also why Marshall is saying the buying and selling of slaves is simply not happening here. It's happening by the Arabs, by the Ottomans is where it's happening. So what are we going to do? So he says, you have to find out what's going on hundreds of miles away in Istanbul, find out how they're being sold, and that's what needs to happen over here. He concludes his tshuva by saying as follows. Everything I told you now, that's the way it seems to me mitzad din. However, I consulted with Moshe Yoshua, a man named Moshe Yoshua, and he told me it's actually not smart to let this guy, to not redeem this guy. In other words, overpaying is the smart thing. Why is it overpaying the smart thing? Because what's going to happen? If he's gonna be killed, what's the people who are doing this? What are they really after? They're really after money. So if they killed him, they didn't get their money. What are they going to do? They're going to find another way to get your money. So the better thing is just cut your losses, give them the money, and walk away. But if they kill him, then they're going to find another way how to extort money from the community. So that's one reason why it's not a good idea. The smarter thing here is to actually overpay. Secondly, he says, if the guy's going to end up converting, so besides for the first concern, which may still be relevant, but then he's going to, what's his story going to be? I was not redeemed by the Jewish community. So what's he going to do? Hate the Jewish community. So what's he going to do? Now as someone who converted, he's going to target the Jewish community and start slandering. And there was a long history of Jews dealing with these Mishumadim who caused a lot of pain to the Jewish community. And so he's going to be one of them. So we don't want that either. So what's the smartest thing to do? The smartest thing to do is to taka get this guy out. Which would mean as follows. This is the way, again, this is my understanding of the Tshuva Maram Lublin, though I have to say, maybe, I don't know if everyone will agree with this, but this is my understanding of the Tshuva. If you want to know if it's mutter to overpay, it's mutter to overpay. If you want to know if it's a chiyuv to overpay, it's not a chiyuv to overpay. The second it's not a chiyuv, what's going to happen? Then you have people who say, I don't want to step up here. I don't want to step up. Because this is a person, he did an immoral act, he caused a problem for himself, so I'm not in. And members of the community are going to say they don't want to do it. What he's saying now, and they're right, it's not a chiyuv. But what he's saying at the end is, no, the community has to worry about its future, and part of worrying about its future, actually over here, the smartest thing to do is to actually overpay. And so yes, you could force community members to overpay for the reasons that we have over there at the end. So the bottom line is, that although this tshuva, Bashkafa Rishona, did sound like it's saying there's an isser and we don't overpay and we slave market and that's it. And then at the end there's a balabata shasvara of why maybe it should be okay to an exception. I think the language and the context and especially the way he speaks about Tosis makes it pretty clear that he's actually not discussing a isser and a heter, He knows about the heter. Everyone knew about the heter. It was a very, very obvious thing. This was the lived Jewish experience during that period of time. The question that wasn't explored by any of the other sources that had all those heterim was, did it ever cross the line into becoming a chiyuv? No, it didn't cross the line. If a community wants to say that they interpret the Takanas Chachamim in the stricter way, grappled, they have the right to do that. So no, it doesn't turn into a chiyuv. And so the takeaway from here is that during this 200 years, during this period of 2 centuries, we see Pidyon Shvuyim meant we're getting everybody out. That's what de facto what it meant. There were different avenues for how to achieve that, which we explored in this class. That's good part 1 for a discussion about how does that translate into the centuries that followed, including in Eretz Yisrael, which we'll have a conversation about that in a future shiurim. Be'ezras Hashem Yisborech.